The steam curled through the air like breath from some great beast, wrapping the platform in a damp shroud. I had come to the station early, planning to surprise Thomas before his trip north, my heart fluttering with the quiet satisfaction of a good wife. But as the crowd shifted, I saw him standing by the second carriage, and beside him a woman I did not know. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand lightly brushing the sleeve of his coat, as if she'd been there 100 times before. My first instinct was to wave, to stride forward with a smile, but something stopped me, a stiffness in his posture, a sideways glance that avoided the crowd. I stepped back into the shadows, my gloved hands tightening on the handle of my own small bag. They spoke briefly, and then the whistle blew, urgent and long. In the rush, Thomas bent to adjust something, and in that instant the woman moved toward the train. It was then I saw it, his suitcase, a sturdy brown leather piece I knew as well as my own. But it was not in his hand. It sat by the bench near the edge of the platform, untouched. I waited for him to turn back for it, but the carriage door slammed shut, the guard's flag dropped, and the wheels began to turn. The train pulled away, carrying Thomas and the stranger into the fog, while the suitcase remained where it was, silent and waiting. For a moment I simply stared at it, my mind scrambling for a reasonable explanation. Perhaps he had another bag, perhaps he would send for it later. But the leather was unmistakable. The brass initials TG shone faintly under the station lamps. The crowd thinned around me, and still no one came to claim it. Finally, my feet carried me forward, each step heavier than the last. I placed my hand on the handle. The leather was cold, almost damp from the mist, and heavier than I expected when I lifted it. My heart thudded in my chest. This was not the weight of clothes and toiletries. Something dense shifted inside with a muted thump, the sound of objects packed with care. I glanced around. No one was watching. With a quick glance at the nearest porter, who was busy with another passenger, I crouched and unlatched one of the brass clasps. It snapped open with a quiet click. Inside, folded between layers of men's shirts, was something wrapped in oilcloth. I pulled at the edge, my fingers trembling, and felt the unmistakable chill of metal. When I peeled it back, my breath caught. It wasn't a shaving kit or a flask. It was a pistol. Beneath it, tucked in the lining, lay a sealed envelope stamped with the crest of a foreign government. The paper was thick, official, and smelled faintly of tobacco. My pulse roared in my ears as I snapped the suitcase shut and straightened, the weight of what I'd found pressing into my hands. Somewhere in the swirling steam, the echo of the departing train faded into the night, taking Thomas and his secrets farther away from me with each turn of the wheels. Before there was the suitcase, before the pistol and the envelope, there was the marriage. Neat, proper, and for a time quietly content. Thomas Grant had returned from the war in the spring of 1919, his uniform pressed, his medals polished, his smile as warm as the April sun. He was the sort of man who drew trust without asking for it, and I, foolish or fortunate, gave him mine without hesitation. For 3 years, we lived in a rhythm that was almost domestic bliss. Almost. The first cracks appeared quietly, like hairline fractures in glass. Letters would arrive at odd hours bearing foreign stamps and no return address. He began spending 2 or 3 nights each month in London, on business, returning with the faint scent of tobacco I did not keep in our home. When I asked, he would give me a quick kiss, an easy laugh, and a line about railway contracts or import licenses. It was just plausible enough to leave unchallenged. The war had left him with certain habits, locking the study door when he worked, keeping a trunk in the attic that I had never seen opened. I told myself this was simply a soldier's way, guarding what mattered. Yet there were nights when he would wake in the small hours, dress in silence and leave without explanation. The first time I followed him to the edge of the lane, watching as he vanished into the fog like a man who belonged to another world entirely. Last week a letter arrived while he was away. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the envelope bore a faint smear of ink across the seal, as though it had been opened and closed again in haste. I should have left it untouched. Instead, I slipped it into my apron pocket and read it in the pantry. The words short and sharp. Arrival confirmed. She will accompany you. Documents enclosed. There was no signature. When I confronted him that evening, I softened my tone, pretending it was only curiosity. He smiled, shook his head, and told me not to worry about dull formalities, the kind of dismissal a man gives when he knows the matter will be dropped. And for a few days I did drop it, telling myself there was no proof of wrongdoing. But the words, she will accompany you, repeated themselves in my mind, like the chime of a distant bell. So that morning I decided to meet him at the station without telling him. I imagined surprising him with a kiss before his train, perhaps easing whatever strain had grown between us. Instead, I found him with her, Beatrice, though I didn't know her name yet, and his suitcase abandoned on the platform. The moment I touched the handle, I understood this was not the story of an affair. This was something else entirely, something that felt like standing at the edge of a drop into darkness. The steam and noise of the station seemed different in memory now. Less the bustle of travel, more the hum of a place where people vanish into shadows. As I sat at home that night, the suitcase beside me on the settee, I realized that I had only two choices. I could return it to him and pretend I had never looked inside, or I could find out exactly why my husband was traveling with a pistol and a sealed foreign envelope. By morning, the fog had thickened into a pale curtain that muffled the world. I had barely touched my breakfast when the knock came, firm, deliberate, the kind that announced authority. When I opened the door, a man in a dark overcoat and bowler hat stood on the step. His grey eyes flicked past me into the hallway, as though taking the measure of my home in a single glance. "Mrs. Grant?" His voice was steady, almost courteous. "Inspector Harold Finch, Railway Police." He produced a small leather wallet with an official badge before slipping it back into his pocket. "I believe you were at Paddington Station yesterday morning." The name slid over me like ice. I nodded slowly, saying nothing about the suitcase still resting in the parlour. Finch adjusted his hat and leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "A certain item was left behind. Property of your husband, I believe. It may be connected to an ongoing investigation." His tone made the word investigation sound far graver than a case of misplaced luggage. I tried to arrange my features into polite confusion. "A suitcase? Yes, I saw it, but when I returned home, it wasn't there." It was the first outright lie I'd told to a man in uniform, and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. His eyes searched mine for a long moment, as if he could read the truth in the fine lines of my face. Finch's expression did not change. "If you should happen across it, Mrs. Grant, I urge you to contact me at once. I must warn you, for your own safety, not to attempt to open it. The contents are sensitive." His pause carried a weight that suggested dangerous. He handed me a card with his name neatly printed above a London telephone exchange. After he left, I stood at the window watching his figure disappear into the fog. It struck me that his visit had been less a courtesy and more a test. He had wanted to see my reaction, to judge whether I was a woman who knew more than she should. If so, I had passed, or perhaps failed, in ways I could not yet measure. I turned back to the parlour where the suitcase sat on the table like a silent accusation. Finch's warning echoed in my mind, but so did the feel of the pistol's cold metal under my fingers. Whatever Thomas was involved in, it was now mine as well, whether I wanted it or not. And somewhere between the inspector's polite menace and my husband's evasions, I realized a truth that unsettled me more than either. I was no longer just a bystander. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the mantel clock, each beat urging me forward. I locked the parlour door, a habit I had never kept before, and pulled the suitcase onto the table. My fingers lingered on the brass clasps, half expecting the weight of Finch's warning to stop me. It didn't. The locks gave way with a soft snap, and the smell of leather and faint tobacco rose like the breath of another life. On top lay neatly folded shirts, pressed so sharply the creases could have cut skin. Beneath them, a pair of polished shoes wrapped in newspaper, as though even scuffs had no place in this arrangement. But it was the lining of the case that drew my attention. A thin seam along the side, stitched with a precision that seemed deliberate. I slid my nail beneath it, tugging gently until the stitches loosened. From the narrow cavity I pulled a small velvet pouch, no larger than my palm. Inside lay a locket, heavy and gold, the kind one might give a sweetheart. I pressed the clasp, and it sprang open to reveal not a photograph, but a sliver of glass. A micro-photograph, tiny enough that the details were indecipherable without a lens. Whatever it showed, it had been hidden with the care of something worth killing for. I replaced the locket in the pouch and set it aside, my hands now working faster. Under the shirts I found a folded map of southern England, marked with faint pencil notations along railway lines. Slipped between the map's folds was a passport, British on the outside, but when I opened it, the name inside was not Thomas Grant. The photograph was his, but the identity belonged to a David Clark of Southampton. Finally, tucked beneath the false bottom panel at the base, I found the envelope I had glimpsed at the station. Its seal bore the insignia of a foreign ministry, embossed, official, and intact. I held it to the light, but the thickness of the paper betrayed nothing of its contents. My fingers itched to break the seal, but I hesitated. Some part of me knew that once I crossed that line, there would be no turning back. The clock struck 2, the chime loud in the quiet room. I sat back, breathing hard, my mind pulling at the threads of possibility. A false name, a pistol, coded photographs, foreign documents. None of this belonged to the man who used to bring me violets from the garden on Sunday mornings. Whoever Thomas was now, he was no longer entirely mine. And if Finch's warning was true, I was holding the kind of secrets that could cost a person their life. I repacked the suitcase with the same meticulous care it had arrived in, but the weight of knowledge could not be tucked away so easily. I had begun with questions about a woman. Now I was staring into a web of intrigue that reached far beyond love or betrayal. Somewhere in that web, Thomas was entangled, and by opening the suitcase, so was I. I first saw her again 3 days later, stepping down from a motorcar outside the Savoy. Even in the afternoon haze, Beatrice Hale looked as if she had been sketched in bold strokes, a dark cloche hat drawn low over her brow, a fur collar framing her pale face, and a smile meant only for herself. She moved with a confidence that suggested she belonged everywhere she set foot, even the gilded doors of London's finest hotel. I had no plan when I slipped from the tram and followed her across the pavement. My gloves were plain, my coat modest, but I kept my head down, trusting the anonymity of the city to conceal me. She entered the hotel with a brief word to the doorman, who touched his cap in recognition. Not a stranger here, then. Inside, the scent of polished wood and cigar smoke curled around me, but I stayed back, watching her reflection in the mirrored columns. She did not linger in the lobby. Instead, she crossed to a side hall that led toward the tea rooms. I trailed behind at a careful distance, keeping other patrons between us. At the far end, she paused by a table where 2 men sat in long coats, their hats resting on the polished wood. No tea, no food, only a small leather case between them. She placed her gloved hand on the case for the briefest moment before sliding into the chair opposite. The conversation was inaudible from where I stood, but their posture spoke in its own language. Leaning forward, heads close, eyes darting to the room's edges. Every so often, one of the men would jot a note on a scrap of paper, fold it once, and tuck it into his pocket. Beatrice never touched a pen. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but her eyes moved sharply, taking in details I could not see. When a waiter approached, I ducked behind a pillar, pretending to study a gilt-framed painting. By the time I dared look again, the men were gone, leaving Beatrice alone at the table. She reached into her bag, retrieved a cigarette, and lit it with slow precision, as though she had all the time in the world. The case was gone. I considered leaving then, but something in the way she rose, quick, purposeful, drew me on. She exited through the side door into a narrow street lined with shuttered shop fronts. The sound of her heels echoed against the damp brick walls, a steady rhythm I kept just behind. When she paused at a lamppost, glancing back over her shoulder, I pressed myself into the alcove of a closed milliner's shop, holding my breath. She did not see me. Instead, she crossed to a waiting motorcar, its engine idling low. As she stepped inside, the driver leaned out just enough for me to glimpse his face, and in that instant, I recognized him. Inspector Finch. The car pulled away, vanishing into the curve of the street, leaving me in the rain with a new truth that struck colder than the fog. The woman I thought my rival was working with the very man who had warned me to stay out of this. I chose the cafe deliberately, small, discreet, tucked away on a side street near the river where the fog rolled in like a living thing. It was the sort of place where people met to exchange confidences or to make them vanish. I had sent a note to the Savoy, written in a neat, unfamiliar hand requesting a meeting. I wasn't sure she would come, but something told me curiosity was one of Beatrice Hale's weaker defenses. When she entered, the bell above the door gave a soft chime. She removed her gloves as she approached, her eyes holding mine with a faint, amused recognition. "Mrs. Grant," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "I wondered how long it would take you." She slid into the chair opposite me without waiting to be invited, setting her gloves beside her cup. "I saw you with my husband," I began, my hands steady on the porcelain. "And I saw you with Inspector Finch. I think you owe me an explanation." My tone surprised me, calm, almost detached, but beneath it, my heart was a drumbeat. She studied me for a long moment, as though weighing the measure of my will. "Your husband she said at last, is not the man you believe him to be. But then neither is Finch and neither am I. She leaned forward, her perfume faint but intoxicating, her eyes sharp. This is larger than an affair, Mrs. Grant. Much larger. And if you value your life, you will return that suitcase to me. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I sipped my tea, letting the steam rise between us like a veil. If you want it, I said finally, tell me why it contains a pistol, false identification, and documents from a foreign ministry. Tell me why my husband is traveling under another man's name. Her smile flickered, the first crack in her composure. What you found, she said, is evidence of a network operating on both sides of the channel. Your husband is in over his head, not by choice, but by necessity. Finch is trying to shut it down, but there are those who would see every witness silenced before that happens. She stirred her tea once, twice, and set the spoon down. You've made yourself visible, Mrs. Grant. That was your first mistake. I felt the weight of her words settle between us, but I refused to shrink from them. And my second? I asked. Beatrice's smile returned, though softer this time. Believing you're not already a part of it. She stood then, tucking her gloves into her bag, and left without another glance. I remained at the table, my untouched tea cooling before me, the truth both clearer and more treacherous than ever. The letter arrived at dusk, slipped under my door without the sound of a knock. My first thought was Finch, some formal summons, perhaps a demand, but the handwriting on the envelope was one I knew as well as my own. Thomas. I broke the seal with fingers that trembled despite my will to keep them steady. Evelyn, it began without preamble. You must not speak to Finch again. You must not give the suitcase to anyone, especially the woman you saw at the station. I will explain everything when I can, but for now, trust me. Hide it. Destroy nothing. And for God's sake, stay away from the station on Friday. The message was unsigned, as though even his own name had become a danger to write. I read it twice, then a third time, hearing his voice with each line, urgent, pleading, stripped of the easy charm that had always shielded us from difficult truths. But his warning against Beatrice clashed with hers against Finch, leaving me tangled in a web of distrust. Both claimed to want my safety, both insisted the other was dangerous, and both seemed certain the suitcase was the key. That night, I moved the case from the parlor to the attic, tucking it behind a stack of hat boxes. The pistol I kept separate, wrapped in an old scarf and hidden in my sewing cabinet, a quiet insurance against whatever might come. I told myself I was only buying time, but every creak of the floorboards sounded like a step toward discovery. By morning, I had decided to answer Thomas in the only way possible, without exposing myself. I sent a telegram to a post office box in Southampton, the one I had found inside the false passport. Received your message. Suitcase safe. Need to see you in person. It was as much truth as I dared to send. 2 days passed with no reply. On the third, I saw Finch standing across the street from my house, speaking to a constable. He did not look toward my window, but his presence was no accident. That same afternoon, a boy delivered a folded slip of paper through my letterbox. No envelope, no name, only a single line. Friday, 9 o'clock. Westbound platform. I did not know whether it came from Thomas or from someone who wished me harm, but the decision was already forming in me. I would go. Not because I trusted him, or Beatrice, or Finch, but because I could no longer endure the waiting. If the station was where the truth would be revealed, then the station was where I would be, and whatever I found there, I would face it with my own eyes. The station on Friday night was a cavern of shadows and steam. Lamps burned low, their light swallowed by the fog that clung to the platforms. I kept my coat collar high and my hat brim low, the suitcase's handle biting into my gloved fingers. Every hiss of an engine, every shuffle of a passerby set my nerves straining toward the sound. I reached the westbound platform with 5 minutes to spare. It was nearly deserted. Only a porter stacking crates at the far end, a couple whispering near the timetable board. And then, from the edge of the mist, Thomas emerged. His face was leaner than I remembered, his eyes darting with a hunted brightness. Relief bloomed in me for a heartbeat. Then I saw the smear of blood on his cuff. "You came," he said, taking my hand for the briefest moment. "Good. Now, give me the case, and you must leave. This is no place for you." His voice was raw, urgent, but before I could answer, another figure stepped from the shadows, Beatrice. Her coat swung open just enough for me to glimpse the holster beneath. "Don't," she called, her tone like ice over water. "Evelyn, if you give him that case, you'll both be dead before dawn." The air between them tightened, as though a wire had been strung across it. Thomas's jaw set hard. "She's lying," he told me, though his eyes flickered past me toward the approaching footsteps. From the opposite end of the platform, Finch appeared, hat low, overcoat drawn close, one hand deep in his pocket. "Mrs. Grant," he called, "bring it here. Now." His voice carried the weight of command, but there was no badge in sight, no constable at his side. Just him, and a narrowing space in which to choose. The first shot cracked through the steam before I could decide. A burst of splinters flew from a crate near the porter, who dropped to the ground with a cry. Thomas shoved me toward the wall, shouting something I couldn't hear over the rush of blood in my ears. Another shot rang out, and this time the sound was followed by the sharp, wet gasp of someone hit. When the fog shifted, I saw Beatrice clutching her arm, blood blooming dark against the pale wool of her sleeve. Finch was gone, vanished into the swirl of steam. Thomas grabbed the suitcase from my hands, his grip bruising. "Stay here," he said, but his eyes told me he knew I wouldn't. He turned toward the track, toward the glow of an approaching train. The case clutched like salvation. I stepped forward, calling his name, but the whistle drowned my voice, and in the chaos, I saw only the blur of his coat disappearing into the train's open carriage. The doors slammed, the wheels shrieked, and the train pulled away, carrying him, and the truth, into the night. I was left on the platform with Beatrice bleeding at my side, the smell of gunpowder in the air, and the realization that I had lost far more than a husband in that moment. I half-carried, half-dragged Beatrice to the shadowed mouth of an alley behind the station. The wound in her arm bled freely despite the pressure of my scarf, but her expression remained composed, her eyes sharp even through the haze of pain. "It's not mortal," she said, her breath uneven, "but we have little time before Finch finds us again." "Why?" I demanded. "Why is he after you? After Thomas?" Her laugh was low and without mirth. "Because Finch doesn't want the network stopped. He wants it for himself. Your husband was his courier until he realized what Finch truly was. That case you've been guarding? It's proof. Names, operations, payments from a foreign power. Enough to bring down men in Parliament." The world tilted beneath me. "Then why didn't Thomas come to me? Why all the lies?" Beatrice's gaze softened just a fraction. "Because he knew you'd be watched from the moment he took the job. You were his safest hiding place precisely because you didn't know the truth. Until now." She shifted, wincing, and I tightened the scarf around her arm. "And you?" I asked. "What are you?" She reached into her coat with her good hand, producing a worn leather wallet. Inside, behind a thin sheet of glass, lay an identification card bearing the seal of His Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service. The photograph showed her with shorter hair, sterner eyes, the name below reading Agent B. Hale. "I was embedded in Finch's circle for nearly a year before Thomas stumbled into it," she said. "When I realized he wasn't one of them, I kept him alive, until tonight." Her voice hardened. "He's in danger now, Evelyn. Not from me, but from Finch. And if Finch gets that suitcase, every person named in it will be dead within a week." I pressed my back to the damp brick, my breath catching in the cold air. "You said we have little time. What do we do?" Beatrice looked toward the station where the echo of the departing train still hung in the night air. "We follow him," she said. "And when we find Thomas, you must decide, hand him over to the service or help him disappear." The choice struck me like a stone. Loyalty to the man I had married or duty to something larger than us both. And somewhere deep, I knew that whichever I chose, there would be no return to the life I had known. Southampton's port was still dark when we arrived, the air heavy with salt and coal smoke. Beatrice moved fast, despite her bandaged arm, leading me past silent warehouses to the far end of the platform. There, framed by the glow of a gangway lamp, stood Thomas, suitcase in one hand, ticket in the other. He froze when he saw me, the wind pulling at his coat. "You shouldn't be here," he said quickly. "It's not safe." "I know what's in the case," I cut in, "and I know Finch wants it." My eyes flicked to Beatrice. "You both want it. The question is, who should I trust?" Thomas stepped closer, his gaze pleading. "She'll give it to the service and you'll never see me again. Let me walk away, Evelyn. Please." Beatrice's voice came, sharp and steady. "If you let him go, Finch wins. That case holds names, operations, proof of a network that will kill to protect itself. Thomas is already marked. If Finch gets it, they'll both be gone in weeks." The ship's whistle moaned in the distance. I felt the cold weight of my pistol inside my coat and the heavier weight of choice in my chest. "Tell me the truth," I said to Thomas. "Not the story, not the excuse, The truth. His jaw tightened. Then he spoke. I carried messages for Finch because I had no choice, but I kept records, not to expose him, but to trade my way out. That's what's in the case. My escape, Evelyn. Nothing more. It hit like a blow. He hadn't been a hero in secret. He'd been surviving for himself. Beatrice didn't gloat. She only said quietly, "Now you see. He's not the worst of them, but he's not what you thought." The final boarding call echoed down the pier. Thomas's voice broke. "Choose me, just this once." I stepped forward, my hand closing over the suitcase. For a moment we held it together, the weight of it pressing between us like the years we had shared. Then I pulled it free and turned, placing it in Beatrice's good hand. Thomas didn't argue. He only nodded once, turned, and walked into the ship's shadows. Beatrice looked toward the dark water. "He'll be safer out there, and we'll end this." I stayed on the pier until the steamer's lights vanished into the black horizon, my breath white in the cold air. I had lost not just a husband, but the last version of him I could still believe in. The wind stung my eyes, and when I finally turned to follow Beatrice into the night, I carried with me something heavier than the suitcase, the truth, and I knew I would never again wait at a station for someone else's fate to arrive. From now on, I would choose my own. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next twist. Like this video to let us know you want more tales of love, betrayal, and shocking endings, and share it with someone who loves a good drama. Your support keeps the stories coming.